The waves crashed violently against the boat, spraying salty mist into the air. A sharp cry, almost human, pierced through the storm. Fisherman Carlos squinted through the rain, his heart pounding in his chest. The ocean was thick with mist, making it hard to see even a few feet ahead. But the sound was unmistakable. Another cry. He leaned over the side, peering into the abyss, but all he could see was darkness. Carlos had spent his life on these waters, had seen storms that turned the sea into a wild beast, but he had never heard something like this. Something felt wrong, like the ocean itself was mourning. He wiped his wet hair from his face, trying to focus. His boat rocked violently as the wind picked up. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The cry echoed again, desperate. Panic began to creep up his throat as he turned the wheel sharply. What in the world? His voice cracked, as if the storm itself was trying to drown his words. But before he could process what was happening, a shape appeared. A dog, drifting helplessly on a small, fragile raft. The dog's eyes locked with his as it paddled weakly, and in that moment everything inside Carlos froze. The dog wasn't just lost, it was crying for help. He didn't know why, but something deep within him, something primal, told him that this was no coincidence. The fisherman knew that he couldn't turn away. Carlos had always thought the ocean had a voice of its own, soft at times, angry at others, but it always called to him, like a whispering friend. But today, it was different. The storm was unforgiving, and the sea seemed alive with a rage he couldn't understand. The distant cries he heard would haunt him. Was it a dream? But as the shadow of the dog became more distinct against the chaos of the waves, he realized it was real. This was no illusion. This was a soul crying out for help. Carlos had his doubts. The dog was far from where he usually fished, in an area known for its tricky currents. But something in the desperate eyes of the dog told him there was no time to question. He had to act. He had no idea what he would find when he got close, but he couldn't bear the thought of leaving it behind. The closer he got, the clearer the dog's shape became, but so did the ocean's fury. The dog was exhausted, barely clinging to the raft. The waves knocked it back and forth, and the animal didn't seem to have the strength to fight them anymore. Carlos could feel his pulse quicken. He reached over the edge of his boat, a tremble in his hands as he tried to steady the small craft in the rough water. His heart beat like thunder in his chest. "Come on, buddy, you're almost there," he whispered, the wind almost stealing his words. But it wasn't just the dog's physical exhaustion that moved Carlos. It was the emptiness in the dog's eyes. It had been out here too long. There was no time to think, only to move. With a deep breath, Carlos reached out with shaking hands, grabbing the dog's collar. For a moment, it seemed like the sea had other plans. A massive wave surged toward them, and Carlos gripped the dog tight as the boat swayed dangerously. But the dog didn't struggle. It barely even moved. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a cry for help. Back in the boat, Carlos managed to pull the dog aboard, its fur matted and its body cold to the touch. It was a beautiful animal, small, with dark eyes that were now clouded by fear and exhaustion. Carlos wrapped his jacket around the dog, trying to keep it warm. As the boat crested another wave, Carlos found himself staring at the creature, waiting for it to speak. But the silence spoke louder than words. The dog, trembling and quiet, just lay there in his lap, and then, as if remembering something painful, the animal lifted its head, its eyes locking with Carlos again. A shiver ran down his spine. He reached for his radio, calling for help, but there was a strange stillness in his voice. He was no longer just a fisherman. He was part of something bigger, something he didn't understand. He glanced down at the dog, whose heavy breaths were a stark contrast to the rhythm of the storm around them. There was a story here, something hidden deep within those sad eyes. The journey back to the shore felt like a lifetime. Every wave seemed to pull the boat further from safety, and yet Carlos couldn't help but feel a deep connection with the animal lying beside him. There was something familiar about it, something unsettling. And then it hit him. The dog was wearing a collar, but not just any collar, a collar with a nameplate that read, "Buddy," and a phone number. Carlos stared at it, his mind racing. Why was this dog out here? How had it ended up alone, in the middle of a storm in the vast ocean? He didn't know, But one thing was certain: the dog had been abandoned. And Carlos wasn't just a rescuer. He was a witness to something darker. By the time Carlos reached the shore, the storm had calmed. The waves no longer raged. They lapped quietly against the hull like the ocean had finally exhaled. The dog was breathing steadily now, its body still and calm. But its eyes, those eyes, spoke volumes. They had been through something together. Carlos felt a bond that no words could explain. The dog's owner was found. But it wasn't the reunion that Carlos expected. The person who had claimed to be Buddy's family had abandoned him long ago. But the dog was stronger than that. He had survived, and in doing so, he had found a new purpose, and so had Carlos. In the days that followed, Carlos couldn't stop thinking about the dog. The way it had trusted him, the way it had fought the sea for one more breath. When he finally let go of Buddy, he realized the healing wasn't just for the dog, it was for him too. The world had been harsh, but in this quiet, unexpected moment, the ocean had offered him a chance to heal too. As the sun set over the horizon, Carlos watched Buddy run along the shoreline, free and alive. The sound of the waves, the call of the sea, it was all the same. But for Carlos, everything had changed. Carlos found himself visiting the shore more often after Buddy had been adopted by a family who cared for him deeply. He had given up the dog, knowing it was the right thing to do, but a part of him, something primal and buried deep inside, still ached. His connection with the animal had changed him in ways he couldn't put into words. The ocean still called to him, but now it was different. There was a longing in its roar, a quiet whisper that invited him to return, not just to fish, but to heal. The days grew longer, and the weight of his newfound understanding seemed to settle on his shoulders, like the weight of the sky before a storm. He was haunted by the image of Buddy's eyes, that quiet trust and pain, and how it mirrored his own. For years, Carlos had hidden his own scars, silent battles fought in the shadows of his mind. But now, on the shores where he had found the dog, he stood on the precipice of something deeper, something larger than himself. One morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Carlos sat alone by the water. The wind carried the familiar scent of salt, the ever-present rhythm of the sea in the background. His hand traced circles in the sand as he thought of the night of the rescue. The dog had drifted on a small raft, abandoned by the cruel hands of fate. It was a sobering reminder of the human capacity for carelessness, for neglect. But Buddy had fought through it. He had survived. Carlos exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. It had been weeks since that night, but the memory was still as vivid as ever. And as he gazed into the distance, the sky turning soft with the light of dawn, a thought flickered in his mind. What if he could do more? A quiet change began to take root in Carlos's life after the rescue. He found himself stepping into roles he never thought he'd play, helping local animal shelters, fostering abandoned animals, offering his boat for rescue missions. The tides had shifted, and with it, so had he. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. The sea no longer represented just his livelihood. It had become a calling, a reminder that even in the darkest depths, there was the possibility of light. One evening, as Carlos was getting ready to leave his boat for the day, a call came in from a local shelter. There was another animal in trouble, another soul stranded, lost in the vast world. The woman on the other end sounded desperate, but there was a flicker of hope in her voice when she mentioned the creature's location. Carlos didn't hesitate. He was already in motion. He wasn't sure what he was heading into, but he knew what he had to do. As the boat sliced through the calm waters that evening, the memory of Buddy's haunting eyes resurfaced in his mind. The dog had survived, but what about the others? What about the creatures left behind? Forgotten by those who had once promised to care for them, he arrived at the site, a small uninhabited island known for its treacherous tides and rocky shores. There, struggling against the waves, was a small dog, similar to Buddy, but this one was frail, weak, its body trembling from exhaustion. Its paws barely clung to a weathered piece of wood. Carlos's heart raced. The storm was coming in fast, the waves picking up again. Without thinking, he pulled the boat closer, the engine roaring against the howling wind. The animal's cries cut through the storm, and in those moments, Carlos didn't hesitate. He wasn't just rescuing a dog. He was rescuing a part of himself, healing a wound he'd been unaware of. The dog was smaller than Buddy, but its spirit was just as strong. Carlos pulled it gently aboard, wrapping it in his coat to shield it from the cold. The dog's eyes, like Buddy's, were filled with trust. But there was something else too, something dark, an echo of abandonment and fear. But it wasn't about the fear anymore. It was about giving this small creature a chance to be loved. The storm passed, and in the quiet aftermath, Carlos found himself standing on the shore again, this time with the rescued dog beside him. It was strange, this feeling of connection. As if, with every animal he helped, he was stitching together the torn pieces of his own soul. He didn't know when it had happened, when the transition from fisherman to rescuer had occurred. But it felt right, like the sea had shaped him for this very purpose. He sat down, the dog curling up next to him as the sun dipped low in the sky. Carlos rubbed its fur gently, his hands slow and steady. The bond they shared, though still new, was already profound. And just like with Buddy, he knew that this dog would find its way into the heart of someone who would love it. But in the meantime, it was his responsibility to ensure it was safe, to help it heal from whatever pain it had carried. It was his to love, to protect, until the right family could give it a forever home. The dog rested its head on his lap, the sound of the waves creating a peaceful melody. And for the first time in years, Carlos felt that familiar pull of the sea. Only now it felt like home. Months passed, and the seasons shifted. Carlos continued his work with the shelter, his days no longer measured by the catch of the day, but by the animals he helped, the lives he changed. He had found his purpose on the water, but it was not just about the sea anymore. It was about everything the sea had brought into his life, the creatures it had carried to his shore. One evening, as Carlos sat on the same beach where Buddy had once looked at him with desperate eyes, he watched as a small family walked along the shore, their laughter filling the air. In their arms was a small dog, its eyes sparkling with joy as it darted around the sand. It was Buddy. Carlos stood and watched the reunion unfold before him. Buddy ran toward him, tail wagging, as if remembering the moment when Carlos had pulled him from the water. The dog stopped in front of him, looking up with a gaze that felt like a thank you, an acknowledgement of the love they had shared. And just like that, Carlos understood. This wasn't just about the dogs, the rescues, or the missions. It was about connections, deep, unspoken ties that bound him to the creatures of the sea and to the humans who needed him. It was about love that healed, that crossed boundaries and filled the emptiness. In a world that often seemed lost, Carlos had found something pure. The ocean had called him, and in its call he had discovered his heart. The sky turned pink with the fading light, and Carlos smiled softly, knowing that every journey, every rescue was part of a greater story, one that never truly ends. Carlos's life, once defined by the rhythms of the sea and the predictable churn of daily work, had transformed into something deeper. The waves were no longer just a source of livelihood. They were a reflection of his inner world, ebbing and flowing with the emotions he had buried for so long. The rescue missions had become part of his life, and with each one, he uncovered more of the man he was meant to be. But there was a part of Carlos that still felt restless. The rescue of Buddy, and then the other dogs, had filled him with purpose. But sometimes, especially when he was alone with his thoughts on the water, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more waiting for him. Something larger than the small acts of kindness he had come to rely on. One evening, as he sat on the boat, the water stretched endlessly before him, its surface gleaming under the moonlight. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy. The world felt like it was holding its breath. The radio crackled, pulling him from his thoughts. A call came in from the shelter. A large boat had capsized near the edge of the bay. A family of tourists had been stranded on a small island, and the storm had swept them further out to sea. There was no time to waste. Carlos's heart pounded as he turned the boat toward the coordinates given to him. This was different from his usual rescues. There were lives at stake. He had no time for hesitation, no room for fear. As he cut through the water, the storm that had once seemed distant now loomed ominously on the horizon. But Carlos didn't stop. He couldn't. The wind howled, and the boat rocked violently. But his focus was unshakable. He had found something in this work, something greater than himself, and he wasn't going to turn away now. The island appeared in the distance, its jagged coastline barely visible through the haze of rain. Carlos's mind raced as the boat reached the shore, his eyes scanning for any signs of life. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, and he could hear the distant cries of the stranded family, their voices nearly swallowed by the storm. Carlos's legs were shaking as he leaped from the boat, the sand slipping beneath his feet. He barely registered the cold seeping through his clothes as he sprinted toward the sound. Each step was filled with the knowledge that he had to act quickly. The storm wasn't waiting, and neither was fate. The family was huddled together under a large rock, soaked and terrified. The father, a man in his mid-30s, looked up as Carlos approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "Thank God you found us," he gasped, his voice hoarse from shouting into the wind. Carlos didn't waste time with words. He motioned for the family to follow him back to the boat, guiding them through the slippery rocks. As they made their way back, the rain intensified, stinging his face and blurring his vision. But he kept his focus. There was no room for doubt. As he helped the last of the family members into the boat, Carlos paused for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the dark horizon. The storm was relentless, but something inside him had shifted. He had always been a man of the sea, but now he was something more, someone who could navigate not just the waters, but the storms within himself. The family was safe. They were cold, tired, and shaken, but they were alive. Carlos steered the boat back toward the shore, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He glanced back at the family, each of them wrapped in blankets, their eyes wide with gratitude. But it was the father who caught his eye, giving him a nod of silent thanks. Carlos didn't need words. He had done what he had come to do. But as the boat neared the harbor, something inside him stirred. A deep sense of peace washed over him, and the weight of the years he had spent feeling lost, searching for meaning, seemed to lift. When the boat finally reached the docks, Carlos helped the family disembark. The father gave him a firm handshake. "You saved our lives today," he said quietly, his voice still shaky. "You're a hero." Carlos shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm just doing what's right," he replied, his voice steady but soft. As the family disappeared into the night, Carlos stood on the dock for a moment, watching the last remnants of the storm recede into the distance. The waves had calmed, and the sky had cleared, leaving behind only the soft light of the moon. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Carlos felt as though he had found his place in the world. It wasn't in the silence of the sea or the predictable calm of his previous life. It was in the chaos. It was in the storm, the struggle, and the quiet moments that followed the rescue. The waves were still calling, but now, Carlos understood that his true purpose was not in the sea alone. It was in the lives he had touched, the animals he had saved, and the storms he had weathered, both on the water and in his own heart. As he turned and walked back to his boat, the horizon before him stretched endlessly. And with each step, he felt the tide of his life shift. Carlos had always believed that the ocean had a way of stripping you down, exposing the raw parts of your soul that you buried deep beneath layers of day-to-day survival. But now, after everything he had been through, the rescues, the quiet bond with Buddy, the storms both literal and emotional, he realized the sea didn't just take, it gave too. It gave you a chance to heal, a chance to see what was truly important, and sometimes it gave you the clarity to face the ghosts you had been running from. One quiet evening, weeks after the rescue of the stranded family, Carlos found himself alone at the edge of the docks, staring out over the water. The moonlight flickered like diamonds on the surface, and the sound of the waves crashing gently against the shore was soothing. Comforting, even. But for the first time in a long while, it didn't calm him. It stirred something inside, something that hadn't been stirred in years. He took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs. He had been running for so long, trying to outrun memories, regrets, the decisions that had haunted him. It was easier to stay busy, to get lost in the rhythm of saving others. But tonight, The sea wasn't offering him an escape. It was challenging him to face what he had been hiding from. Carlos had grown up in a small, crowded neighborhood near the water. His family, though poor, had always been there, bound together by love and survival. But when he was a young man, a teenager just starting to carve out his future, tragedy struck. His younger sister, Maria, had gone missing. No one knew what happened. She had wandered off to meet a friend and never returned. The search lasted weeks. The community rallied together. They scoured every inch of the shore, combed through the forests, checked every dock, and even sent boats out to sea. But Maria was never found. The loss had broken something in Carlos. His heart had hardened with grief, and with it, a chasm had opened in his life, a space that nothing, not time, nor love, nor work, could fill. Carlos's thoughts drifted back to the quiet, desperate search for Maria. The hopelessness of those days, the empty feeling of calling her name into the night, and the moment he realized she was gone. It was then that he had stopped trying to understand the world. He stopped believing that everything had a reason, that there was a purpose to pain. But as he sat there, the sea lapping softly against the dock, he realized something had shifted in him over the months. It wasn't just the rescues that had healed him. It wasn't even the animals he had saved, the families he had helped. It was the act of giving himself fully to the moment, of putting aside his own wounds to help someone else. The pain didn't go away, but it became more bearable, more like a quiet scar, something that he could carry without it defining him. And so, with a shaky breath, Carlos stood up, his legs trembling not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what he knew he had to do. He didn't know if he was ready, or if it would make a difference. But it felt like the time had come. The ocean had given him a new purpose. Now, it was time to face his past. He didn't know where to start, but he had to begin somewhere. He made his way to the small house he had grown up in, a place that held so many memories of Maria, of the family they once were. As he walked through the door, it felt different, strange, as though the house, too, was waiting for him to return to it. The walls were still adorned with old family photos, the faded colors a silent testament to the passage of time. The old kitchen table, where his family had once gathered every night, was still there, worn with years of use. But tonight, it felt heavy with the absence of Maria. He sat down at the table, his hand grazing the edge where they used to eat their meals together. His fingers trembled as he reached for the photo album on the shelf. Slowly, almost reverently, he flipped through the pages, stopping on a picture of Maria. Her smile was wide, her eyes bright with a joy that seemed so far away now. He could almost hear her laugh, the sound that had once filled this house with warmth. He closed the album, taking a deep breath. There was no more running. The sea had taught him that. It was time to forgive himself. It was time to let go of the guilt he had carried for so long. The next morning, Carlos returned to the water. This time, there was no storm, no chaotic winds or crashing waves. The ocean was calm, like a mirror reflecting the sky. The soft hum of the boat's engine was the only sound that accompanied him as he sailed into the heart of the bay. He could still feel Maria's absence, still feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. But today, there was a sense of peace in his heart, something that had eluded him for so many years. He had faced the ghosts of his past. And though they would never fully disappear, he had learned how to live with them. As he navigated the boat through the water, he noticed something strange. A small raft drifting aimlessly appeared in the distance. At first, Carlos thought it was just debris, a piece of trash caught in the current. But as he drew closer, he saw it. A dog lying in the center of the raft, its eyes staring out at him. The dog was still, as if it were waiting for something, or someone. Carlos's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to think twice. He reached for the rope, pulled the boat closer, and before he knew it, he was pulling the dog aboard. It wasn't the same as Buddy, or the other animals he had rescued, but there was a familiarity to the way the dog looked at him. A silent plea for help, a quiet understanding. As the dog lay in his lap, Carlos couldn't help but feel that this was no coincidence. The ocean had called him again, just as it had so many times before. But now he understood. The sea wasn't just a place of sorrow. It was a place of healing, of finding closure. and of giving love when it was needed the most. As the boat cut through the water, the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the horizon. Carlos felt a weight lift off his shoulders, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile. He wasn't just a fisherman anymore. He was a man who had found peace, who had faced his past and emerged stronger. The sea had given him a purpose, but more than that, it had shown him that love, true love, could heal even the deepest of wounds. And as the waves gently rocked the boat, Carlos realized that, in the end, it wasn't just the ocean that had saved him. It was his willingness to open his heart, to face the pain, and to love, no matter how deep the storm. As the boat glided smoothly across the now calm waters, the dog nestled quietly in Carlos's lap, its eyes closing in contentment. The sun, now fully risen, bathed the world in warm golden light, casting long, peaceful shadows over the ocean. The storm had passed, both outside and within. For the first time in years, Carlos felt truly at peace. The sea, once a place of loss and despair, had become a sanctuary. It had brought him moments of salvation and healing, and now, it was offering him the closure he had long sought. In the quiet of the morning, as the soft breeze tugged at his hair and the gentle hum of the waves filled the air, Carlos allowed himself to feel the weight of his journey. He wasn't just a man on the water anymore. He was someone who had learned that the true power of healing lies in the ability to love and forgive. Not just others, but yourself. The ocean had given him that gift, and now it was time to share it with the world. Carlos smiled down at the dog, a quiet laugh escaping him. "You're not so different from me, are you?" he whispered. The dog, its body warm against him, wagged its tail slightly, as if agreeing. For the first time in his life, Carlos knew that he wasn't alone. The boat continued its steady course toward the shore. The sky, still bright and endless above him, seemed to stretch on forever, just like the possibilities that lay ahead. And with that, as the waves whispered softly against the hull, Carlos understood that he had finally found his place in the world. Not just as a fisherman or a rescuer, but as a man who had embraced the healing power of love, of forgiveness, and of the sea itself. The boat continued to glide across the water, its movement smooth and steady as the waves settled beneath it, no longer restless, but almost as if the sea itself was sighing in relief. The sky stretched above Carlos, its vastness now offering not just a view, but a feeling of freedom, of endless possibility. The dog, still curled in his lap, shifted slightly, its small body a comforting weight against his chest. Carlos absent-mindedly stroked its fur, feeling the bond that had formed between them, unspoken but deeply felt. The dog, a small creature of the sea's mercy, had taught him something essential. It had shown him the value of stillness, of surrendering to the things we cannot control, and trusting that, in the end, we will find our way. As the boat cut through the water, Carlos's thoughts drifted, and he found himself thinking of his own journey, not just the literal miles he had traveled, but the emotional distances he had crossed. The stormy seas of grief, loss, and regret had once defined him, but now they no longer held him captive. The waves that had once threatened to drown him had become something he could navigate. The resilience he had once thought was buried deep within him had resurfaced, like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long storm. He had always thought of himself as a man of the sea, and perhaps in many ways he was. But today, he understood that the sea had never just been his place of work. It had been his teacher. It had shown him the value of patience, of perseverance, of quiet healing. The ocean had taken from him, yes, but it had also given him more than he had ever expected. It had offered him the opportunity to save, to heal, to rebuild. It had reminded him that nothing, not even the fiercest storm, could wash away the strength that lay within. As the coastline began to appear on the horizon, Carlos glanced over at the dog, whose eyes were now half closed, its body relaxed, the tension that had once radiated from it melting away with every passing wave. In its calm, Carlos saw a reflection of his own transformation. He wasn't the same man who had set out all those months ago. He was stronger, more connected to the world around him, and most importantly, to himself. He had learned that it was okay to feel lost, that it was okay to falter. But that did not mean the journey was over. It was just another part of the process. The boat slowly neared the shore, and the soft sound of the waves lapping against the hull brought him back to the present. The sun was now high in the sky, casting its warm glow across the water, and the world around him seemed peaceful, as if the universe had given him a moment of calm, a moment to breathe. For the first time in a long while, Carlos felt that the storm had truly passed. He let the boat settle into the shallows, the engine purring to a stop as he turned to look at the dog once more. He could feel the weight of what he had learned, the deep unspoken wisdom that came with facing the darkness and emerging from it. The dog stirred, its eyes looking up at him as if it too understood. Carlos smiled softly, the weight in his chest lifting as he felt the sense of peace he had longed for finally wash over him. "I'm going to get you to a good home, buddy," he whispered, his voice steady, the words full of promise. "Just like I found mine." The dog responded with a soft whine nuzzling his hand. Carlos laughed quietly, a sound that felt foreign yet right. It was a laugh full of relief, full of the kind of joy that only comes when you realize that you've fought your way through the hardest parts of your life and emerged on the other side. He had found his way back from the storm, and now he could help others do the same. He climbed out of the boat and onto the dock, the dog following slowly behind him, its steps tentative but sure. As they walked together toward the shore, Carlos turned one last time to look at the ocean that had both taken and given so much. The horizon was still vast, still full of the unknown. But for the first time, Carlos knew he didn't need to fear it. The future was uncertain, yes, but he had learned that it wasn't the storms that defined him. It was how he weathered them. And as the dog padded beside him, the sound of its gentle footsteps in the sand somehow more profound than the roar of the waves, Carlos realized that, for once, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sea would always be there, its waves constantly shifting, always unpredictable. But Carlos had learned that the most important thing was not to fight the tide, but to find peace in its rhythm, to trust it, and to trust himself. With that, he smiled, his heart finally full. The sun sank lower in the sky, casting its golden light over the world, and for the first time in his life, Carlos felt the true freedom of the open ocean, the kind that came not from escaping, but from embracing the journey, every twist, every turn, every storm. And as the evening breeze carried the salty scent of the sea, Carlos knew that this was just the beginning.